Good morning and welcome to the Forum at St. Bart's. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here. Today, we're delighted to welcome Professor Ann Banaszak, who is the head of the Department of Political Science and Professor of Political Science and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the Pennsylvania State University. She's here with us to talk about women's suffrage and evaluating it 100 years after the 19th Amendment. She is the author of Why Movements Succeed or Fail, Opportunity Culture and the Struggle for Women's Suffrage, and the Women's Movement Inside and Outside the State. She also edited or co-edited several volumes, including most recently 100 Years of the 19th Amendment, an appraisal of women's political activism. Professor Banaszak, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to have this chance to talk to the congregation about the centennial for the 19th Amendment.
Excellent. And I invite those of you who are watching, as you have questions, to insert them into the comments of Facebook or the live chat on YouTube. You can also email me at pthompson@stbarts.org. That's pthompson@stbarts.org. Professor Banaszak, I wonder if we can start by just going back to 1920 a little bit and the events leading up to it. What do you think about that period in our history is most relevant to the movements we're living through today?
There are an amazing number of kind of parallels between the sorts of things that are going on right now, and I think the period that led up to the passage of the 19th Amendment, to me, probably the biggest kind of point that's worth reflecting on is the degree to which issues of racial justice that are playing out right now in our society also were very prevalent at that time in kind of multiple different ways. Both in the connection between women's movements and the abolitionist movement that kind of led to the formation of this fight for women's suffrage, but also the degree to which, in many cases, the women's suffrage movement also perpetrated kind of racial injustice in the course of trying to get the 19th Amendment. So it's both that positive connection of social movements fighting together, but also a degree to which there are some points in the history of the battle for that 19th Amendment where some of our probably most famous suffrage activists perpetrated racism in an expedient way to try and get the 19th Amendment.
Yeah, it occurs to me in kind of examining the history of the women's rights movement that the approach to the question of who counts as a woman and who's included in this movement shifts a lot over time. Can you speak a little to those shifts?
It shifts hugely, and it also, I would say, at every point in time there is a tension. So it's not. I think both kind of tendencies are there throughout the movement, but they come to the fore more or less. So if you go back to what is historically considered, the start of the women's suffrage movement, which is the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, right? You have abolitionists who were really mobilized to fight for women's rights because of their work in the abolitionist movement, a movement which gave them opportunities which they hadn't had before, like speaking in public on the issues of race. And so a lot of our very early suffrage activists like Angelica Grimke were also very avid abolitionists. And you have Frederick Douglass at that 1848 convention. There are some people who argue that it was really his voice that got the right to vote on the convention floor through passage. Many women at that 1848 convention were a little bit concerned about this idea of the right to vote, and Frederick Douglass spoke powerfully for it. And you also have suffrage activists in the early years like Sojourner Truth, right, speaking both about race and about sex as kind of ways that injustices are affect her. So, I mean, her speech, "Ain't I a Woman," is really kind of, I think, a highlight that questions, who was counted or who not. I mean, her speech, that speech really was at a women's rights convention. I think it was in Rochester, where she was trying to point out that the visions of women at that time didn't really include her, although she certainly counted. As you go through time, you have the 15th and 14th Amendment kind of cause a break in the women's movement, in the women's suffrage movement, around some women feeling that the issue of racial justice was more important. So they supported the 14th and 15th Amendment. And important there is to remember that's the first time the word male shows up in the Constitution. Until that point, that hadn't been a word that was in our Constitution. And then others who take a turn really away from racial justice because they feel left behind. And finally, as you get to the 19th Amendment, in the kind of early 20th century, you see, African-American women, Chinese American women, Latino women, all fighting for the right to vote. But in the end, to get an amendment ratified, many of our most famous suffrage activists, and here it would be both Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt, chose to take a strategy where they used rhetorics that really discounted, that focused on white women explicitly and the power that white women would bring even in the South. So even racial arguments that enfranchising women would help really consolidate white power in the South.
So one of your books, as I mentioned, is called Why Movements Succeed or Fail. And you look at the suffrage movements both in the US and in Switzerland, which I hadn't realized women received the vote a lot later in Switzerland than in the US. Can you speak a little bit about your answer to the question of why movements succeed or fail? And I know that you are a political scientist by discipline. You're not a historian. How does that inform your approach to this historical movement?
So that very first book, which is that comparison of the US and Switzerland, I was really inspired to get interested in our American history of suffrage because I had been in Switzerland and women didn't have the right to vote when I was there, or not all women had the right to vote while I was there, which I found amazing. And so in looking at why movements succeed or fail, I really was interested in some of the arguments that political scientists and sociologists have kind of pushed for why social movements can succeed. And many of those have to do with the political climate, that there are some political climates or contexts that allow movements to really push for their cause. One argument often is that it is helpful to have political allies in government, for example. Another really has to do with the degree to which political parties feel they need to draw these social movements in order to win elections. That's something that obviously is relevant even right now. And the other side of it is what women need to mobilize and to really make their argument. And so there is a sense that for movements to succeed, that they need to have some basic resources. And those resources include things like the ability to run campaigns, the knowledge to do it, the ability to lobby. I mean, one of the things that's great about the American movement is it really is, I'd say, an innovator in the American political system. So I look at all of those arguments, which are really coming to me from political science, and add to them the importance of really the way that suffrage activists thought about their own political system, so that it wasn't just a matter of whether they had resources to run things, but also just whether they thought they could, in fact, have an influence in particular places. And the easy comparison for Switzerland and the United States is the initiative, because 15 American states have the initiative, and many suffrage activists use that to actually get the right to vote on the state level. In Switzerland, all cantons have the initiative, and there was a national initiative. And yet what I found in the book, for example, is that Swiss women use that initiative less. And partially it was this culture of believing that they really couldn't use the initiative because it would have negative consequences.
In the US, can you speak a little bit to the different strands that exist within the women's rights movement? You get a sort of more progressive, for lack of a better word, approach, more radical approach. You get a more conservative approach, as well as some women who say they don't want the right to vote at all. How do you make sense of all those differing approaches to this issue?
Well, I mean, women as a group are as varied as the population as a whole. So partially, we shouldn't be surprised that there is this really huge variety of women taking different tactics or different approaches. There are kind of tendencies that you see in any movement, and particularly in the women's suffrage movement. The first is one I call justice versus expediency, and it really is that question of, so at the end of the day, if you are allied with racial justice movements, to what degree is that the most important aspect versus the expediency of getting the right to vote? And I've already talked a little bit about kind of that division, right? I mean, I think the second one that you often see is the kind of radical, no holds bars, take to the streets type of movement versus what you would call more staid movements that believe you have to kind of work through the political process, even if the political process doesn't seem welcoming. And you see that at different times in the women's suffrage movement in the United States. The second, I'm focused on the second one for a second. So for example, in the 1900 to 1920, you see the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which really didn't believe in taking to the streets in any sense. They were really good at lobbying, and they believed that you really had to go kind of state by state and build up your state support, and then you were going to get the right to vote. And you can contrast that with Alice Paul's National Women's Party, which basically argued that if you follow that state by state kind of process, it would take longer than till 1920, maybe till 1960 or 70. And so what you really needed to do was confront people about the issue of suffrage and the injustice it showed. And so Alice Paul was really the innovator in the women's suffrage movement in the sense of introducing this idea of suffrage parades, which she and Lucy Burns brought from having worked in the British suffragette movement. They also, frankly, organized to defeat certain senators in the US Senate actively. So they actively took a party stance, whereas the National American Women's Suffrage Association was very strongly nonpartisan and refused to try and unelect those opponents of the women's suffrage movement. You do also have women who are opposed to suffrage, and they generally they exist throughout, but they become more organized towards the end of the period, so between 1900 and 1920, where particularly as you see kind of suffrage being more closely tied to prohibition, and also as you see kind of more and more success, they become more and more organized. And they generally fall into the less, not as confrontational, but they were lobbying at the same time as women's suffrage organizations, and certainly felt that their interests weren't represented in the women's movement. And then finally, I'd also point out the kind of vast array of women's organizations across different racial categories. So African American women don't get, I think there's more attention in this centennial than there haven't been in past years, but they have the number of organizations that are built between 1890 and 1920 that are run by African American women, even as some suffrage organizations are kind of excluding them from their processes. They are mobilizing hugely, and their fight continues through the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s in many of those organizations. So they don't stop in 1920 because they're not enfranchised in 1920.
To what extent was religion a factor in the fight for women's suffrage? I know that there was some overlap between the temperance movement and the women's suffrage movement, and that religion was a factor in the temperance movement. To what extent did religion play a role at all, if at all, in the movement for women's suffrage?
Well, I mean, so the religion actually plays a very huge role in the US, not so much in the organizational side, although there are women's clubs that are in all different locations, including the church, that play a role. Certainly in the very early periods, that tie between abolition and religion is very strong. I tend to think of Quakers particularly, but that was not the only group that really religious women who were advocating for abolition and in the course started to become interested in women's rights. And then, and the other thing I'd mention is Chautauqua, which was in New York, a very long established kind of and I may characterize it wrong. I think of it as a church camp where people came together to worship, but also to discuss important issues of the day, much like this forum, right? Where it was both religious and it was an opportunity to consider how that religion ties to these important issues. And so that was also a spot where early women's suffrage activists spoke fervently about suffrage. When you get to temperance, it is still tied, obviously, to religion. The Women's Christian Temperance League is an important part of the suffrage movement. We tend to focus on suffrage organizations, and I do that too, to some extent, but they had a huge franchise department, and in some states, they were the organization that led the fight for women's suffrage. There wouldn't have been as strong groups from these other just purely suffrage organizations. In that sense, women, I mean, for the WCTU, the right to vote was also seen as a way of helping women serve the community and help each other, as well as help the families, many of which were suffering from issues of alcoholism.
Where does the women's rights movement go after 1920? What kind of directions does it splinter into?
So, I mean, we have a hole in our history. We end in 1920 and then we pick up in 1960. And the interesting thing is that there is an awful lot going on in that period. So first and foremost, African American women are still organizing around racial justice and the right to vote. And that continues through the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. So many of the organizations like the National Council of Negro Women, and they continue on throughout this period fighting lynching in the South, the repression of Black voters in the South, but also still seeking the right to vote, right? So really 1920 in that sense is not an end for them at all. It's just a kind of breath while they continue the battle. And that's true also for Latino women and Chinese American women, right? All of these women were not enfranchised by the 19th Amendment. So that battle, it can kind of continues on. Secondly, the women's suffrage organizations continue on in some form after 1920. So the National Women's Party turns around and in 1923 writes the Equal Rights Amendment, right? And from then on, they are fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment through the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and still to this day, right? So they continued the battle and didn't see suffrage as an endpoint in any sense. The National American Women's Suffrage Association took kind of a different tact. They did see the battle of suffrage has ended, so this was the main factor they were looking for. But at the same time, they felt that that was just then the start of having women be a powerful voice as voters. So in 1920, they vote to disband and form the League of Women Voters, which is still around today, which is from the very early period is a group that in the beginning advocated for women running for office, but also really heavily focused on informing women voters and making sure they had the information they needed to make informed choices as they join political parties. So those two organizations kind of continue on. And the one group that I haven't really mentioned yet are of course, trade union women who are also battling for suffrage at this time. And for them, the vote is very much of an expedient way of helping kind of working women to get the kinds of protections they need. And so they continue fighting for that throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s as well. So really, although we tend to think of it as an endpoint, it's really just a kind of breath in a continuation of a battle. And you see this in Congress with women's organizations really testifying throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s until the kind of advent of the new women's movement when new groups start to take over.
How do you explain the US's willingness to grant women the right to vote, but not to grant them equal rights, at least in a constitutional sense? How do we make sense of the failure of the ERA, at least in the 60s and 70s?
Well, I mean, I think one thing is to recognize that all of the rights we grant and we don't grant are somewhat affected by a process, and the US has a very difficult process, right? It's meant not to allow the Constitution to change very easily. And I think we have to kind of acknowledge that and recognize also that there are strong organizations, particularly on the anti-side, that develop in the 70s and 80s, like Phyllis Schlafly's kind of Stop ERA, right, which also have a voice in what's going on. But I study a lot of countries, and the other thing I've noticed kind of in my research is that it's not unusual, actually, that rights that we grant are partial or incomplete. So I was doing some work in Australia, and an interesting fact about Australia is that Australia was very early in giving women the right to vote, 1902, which makes them one of the first countries in the world. But they didn't give women the right to run for government until around 1920, 22, 24. So there was this big time point where they felt that it made sense for women to vote, but not to represent themselves in office. And those kinds of differences exist in a lot of countries where the rights that they grant are partial and incomplete. And so it's quite common that groups need to keep fighting for additional rights kind of going forward.
Do you think the ERA still has a chance of being ratified? And is that still an important goal?
I believe it's an important goal for an equal rights amendment to be enshrined in the Constitution. I think what we can start to understand is that what's written in our Constitution reflects who we are as a people. And so that statement is important just in that sense, but also that to some extent, rights don't always just go forward, they do go backward. And so what's written in the Constitution is in that sense an important protection. So for me, it's important that that be enshrined in the Constitution. I also, it's interesting to ask whether it will happen because there have been very recent movements on the ERA. So the story as it was left in the 80s when the ERA failed was there was an extension granted by Congress with a time limit. And there were not enough states that ratified by that time. There are attempts now to question whether it's legally binding if to have such time limits on an amendment. If not, you then have a number of, then you're back kind of to starting the battle. This year, actually, or last year, I guess in 2019, Virginia became the 38th state to ratify the ERA. So they actually passed ratification with the intent of trying to continue the battle. Now, the issue is that there are 5 states in the meantime who rescinded their ratification. So you would need to kind of have that play out in court. And I suspect we will see that happening in the coming years. So I don't believe that the issue of the ERA is dead, but the mobilization for it is certainly kind of taken second. It's ongoing, but it's not as visual as it was in the 80s as that timetable was running out.
So there are folks who are actively working?
There are. Actually, the National Women's Party continues to battle. Is still around, continues to battle for the Equal Rights Amendment. Many of the what are called second wave women's movement organizations like NOW are also feminist majority, are also paying attention to the Equal Rights Amendment. So it's not at all a dead issue, but it's not, I think, as prevalent as some of the other issues that people in kind of the public consciousness.
When you look at other American social movements, including the social movements of today, the civil rights movement, the movement for marriage equality, Black Lives Matter, do you see the influence of the suffrage movement on these other movements?
Influence is hard to always judge, but sure. Because all of our movements today arise in a period where they have all these historical precedents. But I do see some of the tactics and questions that come up still being kind of raised in all of these movements. Certainly, the one thing I would say is that the women's suffrage movement had a number of just kind of brilliant political strategists. They helped to create, whether you like it or not, the system of lobbying that we have. So they were innovative in their street politics in terms of how to demonstrate and how to pull people in and how to raise consciousness about the concerns that you have. And I see all of those same sorts of qualities in many of these movements, certainly in Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ, marriage equality kinds of issues. They, in many senses, learned the lessons that came from earlier movements, and certainly the women's suffrage movement was one of them as they went forward. So the use of the courts when you can, the street protests and street politics and how to make your issue visible. All of these things I think were things that suffrage activists did really, really well. That served as good kind of lessons for current movements. I do also think the question of building kind of alliances across movements is also one that I've maybe talked about less, but which is something that current movements today also understand, that the women's suffrage movements or parts of it really tried to build. And so suffrage activists, even as they abandon kind of racial justice, they pulled together movements of farmers and other groups in the progressive era and in the populist era to try and build kind of alliances across multiple movements. And that, I think, is certainly an important lesson for today, that, Black Lives Matter is not separate from marriage equality, is not separate from women's issues, but that there are a range of issues that that relate to justice that everybody are important to everybody.
And would you say that the notion of intersectionality has kind of changed the narrative about activism today?
I think, the one thing I find really positive is the recognition of intersectionality in ways that it really was not discussed very often in earlier movements, and the importance of that in tying movements together, right? It's through intersectionality that brings a strength, because it ties our movements together in ways that you don't necessarily have if you're just a women's movement or just a racial justice movement or Black Lives Matter, right? So it brings that connection across movements. I also do think it's been important in places like Black Lives Matter. You do see women raising concerns about, for example, the Say Her Name focus within Black Lives Matter, which points out that it's not just Black men who are who receive the who are killed by police, but also women, and that they do receive kind of less visibility in some cases. So I do think intersectionality is one of the positive things that, as a concept, we've developed over time, and because it allows us to think about all those interconnections, it really builds a kind of stronger movements going forward. So Say Her Name and Black Lives Matter move hand in hand, kind of going on issues of racial justice and police, for example.
In your title not only includes women's studies, but also gender and sexuality studies. And there's been an increasing recognition of gender fluidity in our society, and a continuing discussion about the place of trans people, especially trans women, within the overall category of women. I think of, the most recent kind of scandal involving J.K. Rowling. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the place of trans folks within the women's rights movement and the kind of discussions that go on within feminism about trans people.
So you're focused more on the current, so not heading back to that kind of suffrage era, but now thinking about the women's.
Well, I think both would be interesting. Yeah.
Well, and so obviously issues of sexuality were rarely mentioned in the suffrage era, but I think there is a recognition, especially these days, that in fact, there were lesbian women, there were asexual women in those periods, and there were also ways that women, and I'll focus on women for just a second, that women managed to continue a lifestyle that allowed them to have their own sexuality, even in a period when it wasn't really spoke of or acknowledged or certainly approved of in any sense. So in the early part of the 20th century and late 19th century, people would talk about Boston marriages, which were women who would live together for very long periods of time, really 30, 40, 50 years, where, there was no discussion of sexuality, but where that was allowed and fostered. You do have women forming really close ties that may or may not have reflected kind of deeper sexual relations. The interesting one to me is Carrie Chapman Catt, who was married twice and widowed twice. When she died, she chose to be married next to the woman she shared her life with after her second husband died. Hayes was her name, but I can't remember her first name. So that was for her, the most meaningful of, as she thought about her life, that was who she wanted to be buried next to. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. So there are a lot of these relationships that exist in that time period where we don't know the sexuality, but we know it's important. So going forward, I think if you look at the women's rights movement today, I think there is a recognition of how important transgender, gay, asexual, I mean, all the kind of fluidity of sexuality is to women's rights in the kind of larger sense, because it is the narrow definitions of gender that restrict women and men, but women in particular in ways that are hard to escape. And so accepting and understanding kind of transgender communities, for example, help to break those bounds of who we are, and recognize that there are an infinite number of ways that we can relate to one another, and that there are, that there are not just two genders narrowly defined, but there are a wider array that make a difference to women and everybody.
So we've received a few questions. One person wonders if the pandemic of 1918 had any effect on the adoption of the 19th Amendment. I think aware that we're living through a pandemic now, a little over 100 years later.
That's an interesting question to which I do not have an answer. I know a lot about the year of 1918, but I see, at least in the historical work I've done, haven't seen as much reference to the pandemic. I suspect because it becomes tied in with the end of World War I for the United States. So my guess is that part of the spread of the Spanish flu was related to all of these men coming back from war and kind of expanding out across the United States. So the answer is, I wish I could answer that question. It's actually something that occurred to me as I was thinking about preparing for this talk. You see very little reference to it among women who are writing at the time, but it's also important to remember that at least in kind of 1918, a lot of suffrage work is done by mail and post, and as well as other forms of communication. So I don't know that it tied in there. It certainly brought women more to the fore, as did the war, in their role as healthcare providers and things like that.
Another person asks about draft registration, seeming to remember that some of the opposition to the ERA revolved around hesitation about women registering for the draft. Where might we be if there were ever to be a draft again? Where might we be on women's participation in that? And to what extent do you think that had an impact on the reception of the ERA?
I think, so I'll take the last question first, which is, I do think it had an effect on the ERA, along with a number of other aspects where the ERA was assumed to influence kind of women's separate kind of roles. So as I remember it, because I do remember the end of the Equal Rights Amendment ratification campaign, it was the draft, but it was also the sense that you might have to have common bathrooms, that you might have to, it might affect women's ability to get alimony and divorce proceedings. I mean, many of these things are no longer issues in 2020. So the draft certainly still is around. I know my son registered, but my daughter did not. So it's still gendered in that sense. But my guess is that should the US ever come to the point where they use that draft in wartime, my guess is that that would be less of an issue, that women were also called in some senses. Certainly, all of divorce law issues of common bathrooms are no longer really, I mean, it's still an issue that raises its head a little bit, but less and less so over time. And so many of those issues are kind of disappearing as we progress into the 21st century. And now I've forgotten what the first part of the question was. It had to do with whether these things would affect the Equal Rights Amendment campaign these days. I think potentially. So potentially there are still very traditional women's organizations, the Conservative Women of America, for example, who find those kinds of questions still important. So I can't say that the debate has shifted completely away from those things, but I think what is different from 1980 to 2000 to 2020 is really the sense that if you ask young women whether there should be any difference in law between men and women, most of them say no. They don't consider themselves feminists, but they don't see that there should be a difference in terms of these sorts of legislation.
Another person asks about the League of Women's Voters, and I wonder if you can speak to its history as well as the work it does now.
So, I mean, I'm a big fan of the League of Women Voters in the sense of they really date back to this suffrage organization, and they do amazing work in my mind, especially these days where elections and democracy have become so polarized. They are the one place where they try very hard to remain nonpartisan and provide information. So in the 1920s and 30s, they were a little bit of a different animal than they are today, which is that they did kind of support women candidates from both parties. They were very careful to be nonpartisan, but support women candidates. They also were stronger advocates for certain types of policies, particularly protectionist policies for women workers. But their other and main agenda item has always been to provide a venue where information on the election that is high quality and helpful is available. And so the League in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, I think, continued to play the role of providing information to voters, to encouraging debate among candidates on the local, national, state level, all of those levels. They also continued to advocate for high quality elections. I mean, that's important to them. And so, for example, I was recently served on the Pennsylvania Governor's Commission for Redistricting, and the president or ex-president of the League of Women Voters was there advocating, again, for electoral processes that were fair and equal.
So as we draw to a close, I wonder if you can speak a bit to the state of the women's rights movement now. In 2017, we had the Women's March, which I think may have been the largest protest in US history. Mm-hmm. We've also in recent years had the Me Too movement, kind of exposing sexual harassment and assault in a variety of different contexts. Where are we now and where are we going?
Well, I mean, I do think that 2017, and I would say it really began even earlier, that on my college campus, I saw it maybe 3 or 2 years later with really a rise in young women interested in women's issues like rape on campus and things like that. So I do think we're in a period of heightened mobilization of the women's movement where there is this focus on, harassment, sexual discrimination, violence against women. The Women's March was impressive in terms of the number of women it mobilized. It was the biggest in the United States, but it's also worth recognizing that it occurred all over the world. So even though it was particularly focused on the US, there was this kind of wider influence. And I see it continuing to play out in terms of creating kind of cross different, so intersectional movement across different groups of women. I think you see in Black Lives Matter women from that Women's March coming out and marching in protests in the United States. And I do think going forward that the Me Too movement is here for a little bit longer as well, that it is not at the end of its kind of period of mobilization, but probably at kind of the middle point where there's a heightened sense of how important this is for women. It's played out really strongly in the electoral side, where women who were mobilized by the Women's March then were mobilized to run for office on all levels, from kind of local city councils all the way up to Congress. And I think we're going to continue to see that for the next 5 or 10 years. So,
and there's plenty of work still to do in terms of increased representation.
And there is plenty of work to still be done. I mean, we rank 76th in the world in terms of representation of women in our electoral offices. So, I mean, that's not particularly strong. We can do better.
Well, unfortunately, our time has come to an end, but thank you so much, Professor Banaszak, for taking the time to be with us and mark this important anniversary.
My pleasure. And thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for watching. You can stick around and join us for worship at 11 a.m.